So there's this thing that happens when the sky is so full of stars, when like the Milky Way is so bright in the sky that even though there's no sun, right? There's no sun to see, parts of the world are still lit up. You can still see some of the scene around you, this night scene around you. Hello, my friend. My name is Colby Bloom, and today is day 9 of my 10-day watercolor challenge, World of Color. I am just thrilled to go through this night sky scene with you. Night skies have a very, very tender place in my heart. They are where I started painting landscapes, and I am particularly excited to put a little twist in today's tutorial. See, typically when I go through night skies, especially with beginners, I have the foreground scene be a silhouette, right? Just completely dark, so you can see the contrast between the very light bottom of the night sky with this brilliant, dark silhouette. And while I do love a good silhouette night sky scene, this time we're going to imagine what might happen if the stars were so bright. Or maybe it's just the flash of your camera, who knows? If the stars were so bright that they lit up parts of the scene, so you could actually see dimly some of the world around you. That's what we're gonna try to paint today with Violet Night. There's going to be a Milky Way in a violet sky and a road leading to anywhere, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So let's get started. All right, one thing I have to amend before we get going is the night sky we're painting is not actually going to just be like super dark except for the stars. We are also going to paint the Milky Way as if just the very last remnants of the sun is lighting up the sky and lighting up the space, the landscape around us. So just the very bottom of the sky is going to be super light gold ochre. Okay, so, and the contrast between the yellow of the gold ochre with the violet of the sky, yellow and violet are complementary colors, right? So the contrast of those colors, we're not gonna blend them so that they make muddy mixes, but we are going to put a sliver of yellow with the violet to make like this really bold colorway. So it's gonna be great. First, the sketch. The sketch is to just kind of block out where there's a background mountain, there's a curve for the road, and there's a sliver of land coming in from the left side, right? So the curve going on the back from the right to the left, that's where the mountain's gonna be. Then there's going to be like just a rounded bend where the road is going to be between that sliver that's jutting out from the left to the right and the mountain in the back from the right to the left. There's a curved road you can see that kind of starts like in the center of the page, about a third of the way up, and then the edges of the road, like the left edge of the road curves into the left side, and then the right edge has just a very short line into the right side. So that's the sketch that we're starting with. It does not have to be perfect. Really, you're just painting the background mountain, a curving road, and a little bit of land coming into on the other side of the road. So then we're going to get the sky wet because we're painting the sky very first. And the first thing we're going to do is get very, very light value gold ochre. So this gold ochre is like yellow ochre, except it's a little bit brighter. So I like using gold ochre a lot. So I did a little bit of light value gold ochre, washed off my brush, and now I'm blending the gold ochre into the wet wash of the sky. And so I don't want gold ochre to be like I don't want the yellow part of the sky to be really pigmented. I want it to be so light that it almost like tints the sky a little bit. You could just do gold ochre. I experimented with also putting a little bit of Quin Gold in there too. Either way is fine. The Quin Gold is coming on right now. So this is Quinacridone Gold, a very, very light value Quinacridone Gold. One of the benefits of using gold ochre with skies is that there's not quite as much like bright yellow pigment into it. And so the risk of like making really muddy mixes or creating green or something like that is a little bit less. But, you know, the downside of gold ochre is that it's also a lot paler. So like when you get it, there's not as much pigment, and so when you add more water to it, it kind of washes out. So I kind of experimented with doing a little bit of both. Um, and I think it worked out okay. So I let that layer dry, and as you can see, the yellow is super light, right? We can barely see it, and that's exactly what we want. So I let it dry, then I re-wet with clean water, and now I'm going to add some light value Rose of Ultramarine. So I added a lot of water to Rose of Ultramarine. If you don't have Rose of Ultramarine, that's okay. You can use a different violet. We're just using, like, you can even mix your own violet if you want. The point is that we have, like, it's more of a red violet, but Rose of Ultramarine also has flecks of blue in it. And we used very light value, and then I'm using water to blend it down, right? To blend it around, but I'm leaving behind like a jagged trail of white space. This is a guide that I'm going to use for the Milky Way. So in this painting, I'm using white space mostly, like light layers to create that line, that trail of Milky Way that has, it's gonna go pretty much like starting a little bit on the right side and then going up onto the left side. It's not quite like a straight line, but it's also not like horizontal either. It's just kind of a slightly tilted, jagged curve, like a trail of the Milky Way. And we're using white space to give us a guide for where the Milky Way is going to go in the next layers. So I let that layer dry, that really, really light layer of Rose of Ultramarine on either side, and the the trail of light space, right, of white space where the Milky Way is going to go. And I let it dry, and then I re-wet. And now I'm adding more Rose of Ultramarine, not the darkest yet, so it's not the most pigmented, but it has more pigment in it than the previous layer. And instead of using a size 10 brush, I'm using a size 6 brush. And this is so that I can have a little bit more control, and so that there's less water on my brush and in the paint. And I'm going a little bit more into the Milky Way. So the thing about painting a Milky Way is I've done it so many different ways. And one way that I really like that we're experimenting this time is we're painting basically like dots in the middle of that white space trail and dragging those dots out. So like, the light parts look like they're flickering. It's not so much like it's super light, like this very blazing trail of stars, as much as it is just like flickering light values coming in and out. And one way to get that kind of flickering texture is to use a small brush to add just tiny little bits of pigment that are kind of dotting in and out of that Milky Way trail, right? And so we're starting light and then gradually growing darker, gradually adding more and more pigmented paint. I'm still using Rose of Ultramarine here. I'm kind of just like using that, like I'm dabbing, right? I'm just kind of that motion of like tapping my paintbrush along as opposed to doing uh, long fluid strokes, right? I'm just kind of dabbing it along, so that I can create that kind of flickering texture. So while this wash is still wet, I also went in and I added indigo on top of this wet wash of ultramarine, of Rose of Ultramarine. And so we have like a lot of plays between this violet color, and then we're adding indigo, so we have really like dark blue violet happening with the night sky. And then as I'm getting into the Milky Way, some of my white space is going away, right? And that's okay, because we can go back in with a thirsty brush and lift some of the paint so that we can still have some of that white space. If all else fails, and that's what I'm doing right now, I'm going back with a thirsty brush, I'm lifting some of the paint so that we can have that light space. And if all else fails, I can always tap in some white gouache. I don't really do that this time, but because I didn't really feel the need to, but I do often go back in with a thirsty brush, which is a clean, damp brush, push firmly down on the wet wash and lift so that you can reveal pockets of white space that you might have otherwise covered up as you are adding these layers of pigment. So in order to make the Milky Way work, to get that cool, glimmering, flickering, light texture that's kind of popping out of the sky, you need to preserve the light space, but you also need to have the dark spaces, right? You need to have the dark sky around to contrast with the light. And so one thing you can do is what I'm doing right now is taking a small brush. If you want to add some really dark spots in between those light spots, you take a small detail brush and add even more dots of that dark space. One thing I also did to create more luminosity to push away some of the light space is to splatter on water. If I splatter on water, the water might push away some pigment and create more of that light spaces. So now I have this Milky Way texture. It is imperfect, and that's okay. While this wash is still wet, I'm going to take some white gouache with a little bit of water and splatter it on with my paintbrush. So I'm using a round, but if you use a liner brush would also splatter really well. But I'm using a round number 2 and taking my gouache, and I'm holding my brush with my non-dominant hand and striking my brush pretty forcefully with my dominant hand to make the splatters come off the brush. If you're splattering and not enough paint is coming off, that means you don't have enough water. If you're splattering and too much paint is coming off, like the blobs are really big, that means you don't have enough pigment. So those are just some kind of key things to keep in mind. I did 2 layers of stars here. One while the sky was wet. So I did a layer of stars while the sky was wet, and then I let it dry, and then I did another layer of stars while the sky was dry, and then I called it good. And I think that Milky Way turned out pretty well. So after I let that dry, I'm going to go about painting the foreground here. So first is the background mountain, which is going to be like, we're messing up all of the various rules here, right? Because this background mountain is going to be actually pretty dark. And that's because from our vantage point, the background mountain is a silhouette, okay? So because it's right in front of the lightest part of the sky. And so we're drawing it as if it was a silhouette. I did indigo with a little bit of whatever green was left over on my palette. So that was just kind of like whatever colors are on my palette kind of a thing. And I don't want that mountain to be a flat wash. I want there to be some random texture in it so it looks textured, or like it looks like some of that starlight is glimmering off of it. Then I used indigo to paint the road, and same thing. I don't want it to be just like flat indigo. It's okay if there are some like flickering little bits of like the paint is thicker in some places than in others, because I want there to look like there's flickering light on uneven surfaces. Now I'm going to go about painting this strip of land. And this is the strip of land that we can see, right? Whether it's from the sunlight that's dimming, it's actively leaving, or if it's from, maybe the flash of your camera or whatever. This is a cool scene where we can see the night sky, and we can also see this strip of grass. Now this is too bright. This is not as bright as I wanted. And so I'm painting with colors. Like I started with gold ochre, and then I added some little bits of blue to my gold ochre to make it more green. And I used my foliage brush, and then I took some burnt sienna and I added some dry brush texture just kind of along the bottom. I used my foliage brush again to add more brush to it. And this is where I'm going to say I kind of didn't know what I was doing. I thought maybe I'm going to do like a field of sunflowers, or maybe I'm going to do, I don't know, like a wheat field or something. It wasn't really working out. And that's okay. By the end, I was like, okay, so I'm just going to add a bunch of texture and try to make sure the color looks right. And in order to make the color match with the scene, we don't want it to be super bright. We still want it to have a little bit of blue in it, a little bit of darker, more moody things in it. And so one thing I did is I added some like vertical texture, like some grassy texture coming up from it. And then I added some kind of muted green, which is like gold ochre with a little bit of indigo maybe on top of it, so that this strip of land looks like it's dark, right? It doesn't look bright, but it also it's not invisible either. And so no matter what you do there, like you can do something totally different and that's fine, but no matter what, you want to add a little bit of blue or a little bit of brown or whatever to mute it so that it's not super bright, so it still looks like it's nighttime. Okay, so Now we're gonna add lines on the road. This is just white gouache with a little bit of water to it to add that line on the side of the road with my small number 2. It is gonna be super wonky. It is imperfect and uneven in lots of places, and that's okay. So I added one line that's kind of like that curve on the side of the road, on either side of the road. And then I'm gonna add 2 parallel lines together that are like curving up the middle of the road. And I painted them in white gouache first, and then I painted Quin Gold on top of the white gouache to kind of like tint it, I guess. And I realized that my one of my lines was a little too thick, so I went in after I painted it, and I painted just over part of that too thick line with my indigo to kind of fix that mistake. So there's Violet Night. It was kind of really messy. Like, you know, the side of the land that's jutting into the scene, it didn't work the way that I was hoping to. It kind of, I don't even know what it looks like, and that's okay. I also think the perspective of the road is a little bit off, and that's okay too. I was just having fun. I wanted to see if I could add a road. I wanted to see what it would look like to try to build up the Milky Way sky a little bit at a time. And I wanted to make sure to include this project for sure so that you knew, again, I am an imperfect painter. You do not have to be a perfect painter to enjoy painting something. You don't have to have all of the ideas put together in order to start it. Sometimes I start a project without even knowing what the end is going to be, and that's okay. So what I loved the yellow-violet contrast in the sky, and I loved how we built that using layers. I loved the values in the sky. And things that I learned, I think that I could have worked on the perspective on the highway, maybe added a few more dark values to brighten it up, and had a little bit, like, you know, maybe had a little bit more of a plan for that land jutting into the scene, that foreground part that is, you know, on the left side. But other than that, I thought this project was super fun. I hope you had a good time, and I can't wait to see yours. See you next time.